your Zoom fatigue and willing to spend some time on yet another Zoom call. Hopefully, this will be a little out of the ordinary, a little different than your other Zoom encounters. I thought I'd sort of give a scene setting here at the beginning. I'm standing here in my driveway in Ivoryton, Connecticut, about half an hour east of New Haven, where Creative Arts Workshop is, and about 15 minutes from the mouth of the Connecticut River as it flows into Long Island Sound. So that's sort of where we are. We're lucky enough right here to be pretty much smack dab in the middle of the woods, and so I'm gonna switch the camera around, I think. Maybe I can't. Oh, there we go. Here's the moss garden. Moss just really loves it here. And it's kind of nice because it thrives on neglect. You really don't have to do much to it other than keep the leaves off of it, and it just will grow wherever it feels happiest. And the other thing that's nice is that other things pop up unexpectedly, like these lady slippers.
Wow.
These are native plants. They grow kind of all over the East Coast, but they're not very common. They're in many places they're endangered. I don't think that they're actually endangered here in Connecticut, but you don't see them too many places. So wherever you do see them, count yourself lucky, and we do. We've probably got a couple of hundred of them on our little chunk of land here. So we feel quite lucky. So here's the house. There's the studio. We'll wander in there. This first part of the studio used to be the garage. We enclosed that. I thought that the cars can live outside. I need the space inside.
Right.
So here's the front room of the studio, and this is kind of everything that doesn't have anything immediately to do with clay. I've got some woodworking tools over here. I make a fair amount of my own clay tools, mostly because I've sort of never quite been happy with the tools that you buy, and I usually end up either modifying a purchase tool or just going ahead and making something brand new. More hand tools over here, and then this wall is my display of finished work. And here's a bunch of pots that I'm about to pack up and ship off to a gallery in Los Angeles. If anybody knows Freehand Gallery in Los Angeles, they're a wonderful gallery. I'll give them a plug. But these will be in Los Angeles sometime next week.
Awesome.
And some work here. These are some wood-fired pieces, which I don't normally do. My work here is fired in a gas kiln, gas reduction. But my good friend Sam Taylor up in Northampton has a wood kiln, and try to go up there for his firings as often as I can. So it's nice. It's actually nice. I think it's better than having a wood kiln is having a friend with a wood kiln.
Right.
Here's some more. Most of these are wood fired, except for those ones in the dead middle. Everything else is wood fired. And then these here are pretty typical of the work that I'm doing here in my gas kiln. Some larger platters up there.
Hayne, can you talk a little bit about the difference in your range of color between your gas firings and your wood firing?
Yeah, so typically wood firing gives you, well, it all depends on your approach, but what I find I like best out of the wood kiln are really kind of earthy tones, not a lot of bright color, which is usually not what the wood kiln is best at doing anyway. It can be much more subtle, but within that subtlety, you can get some really stunning effects.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole different approach, and you learn what does best in which kind of kiln, and I feel very fortunate that I have the choice.
Absolutely.
And so here are, those are out of the wood kiln, and there's a fair amount of color there.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I shouldn't say that it's all muted earth tones, but that wonderful rusty orangey color there is pretty typical in a wood kiln, almost impossible to get any other way. So that's one of the lovely things about the wood kiln.
Awesome.
On the other hand, there's lots of things you can't do in a wood kiln. These sort of subtle copper matte, at least I haven't been able to. So that's when I would use my gas kiln here, if this is the sort of the effect that I wanted.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so let's wander into the main room of the studio. That is an absolutely bare and clean table, and I don't want anybody to think that it always looks like this. It's usually piled high with stuff, but giving a video tour is a good excuse to clean up the studio every so often. And I've never, well, this is, as I was telling Robin and Grace, this is the first time I've done this kind of a tour, which is kind of a silly thing to say because it's obvious that this is not a masterful performance here. I'm sort of winging it here. Here are my. This is the Potter's chemistry set. The various chemicals, minerals, colorants that go into making glazes and slips, and these are just sort of sample quantities that I use when I'm mixing up tests. A test will go on a little tile, a small clay tile that'll then be fired, and so that way I can see how things are working and which direction I might want to take that particular mixture next. I saw a question pop up, but then it disappeared.
We just have one. It's what do you use for a work surface? But I think
Ah,
that
yeah,
center table.
right. So depending on what that surface is going to be used for, here, this is kind of my glaze table.
Mm.
There are my buckets of glaze underneath. And so because this table is often gets pretty wet, I've finished it with a sealer and not a lacquer, but
Like a
a
poly.
waterproof finish. It's gotten a lot of wear, and so it's not. I wouldn't call it watertight by any stretch of the imagination. But that was sort of the idea, is to try to keep this surface for glaze work, wet work. The surfaces that I would normally use for clay, I like to use unfinished bare wood. This is a hardwood plywood, kind of a cabinet grade plywood. So it's a very fine grain. It's much tighter grain than you would find in a normal piece of building plywood, sheathing, siding plywood. And it's a wonderful surface to work on. It doesn't leave an impression on the clay. A lot of times, I think you'll see canvas covering a work table surface, which works pretty well, but to me, it leaves that canvas impression on a slab of clay. So, and then you have to, if you don't like that, and then you have to work hard to get rid of it. And working on a much smoother surface, to me, just makes a lot of sense. And the fact that it's unfinished means that clay doesn't stick to it.
Right.
So, but it's, that's probably a $50 piece of plywood right there. So you don't want to put that on every single surface, obviously, but the surfaces that you're going to use a lot, I think it's worth it to put something down that will give you a lot of workability. Another table over here, which is a much plainer piece of plywood, but I'm usually not working directly on it. I'm usually, as you can see here, I'm storing a lot of stuff on it when it's in the process of being worked on. So I've got all these pieces that are sort of halfway done, that I'll then move over to this surface when I'm ready to put them together. And then over here are the Bisque shelves. This is all work that's been fired once in the Bisque fire, just to get it hard enough so that you can handle it when you go to glaze it. So as I make things, I will bisque them in a small electric kiln, and then pile them up here until I'm ready to do glaze firing. And the glaze firing will usually take a couple hundred pieces of pottery, depending on their size.
Wow.
So I've probably got half a kiln load here, and it'll take me another month or so to get enough work to fill the kiln. And then this is the kiln room. So there's some more pieces there. On the top, there are some pieces that have already been decorated and glazed that I wasn't able to fit into the last firing. So they're here waiting to be put into the next firing. A couple of vases there. There's my electric kiln that I use for bisque.
Yeah.
My stash of clay. And then let's go outside again to the kiln. Here's the backyard.
Great.
So it's really just a pile of bricks with a chimney and a roof. The bricks are dry laid, and every couple of, well, I would say every 6 or 7 years, they sort of need to be repointed. So you take it all down and you put them back together, and it's a pretty quick process. You can do it in a day. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward thing. These are the gas burners here on this end. There's 2 of them. You can see the gas hoses going to them.
So, Hayne, we have a bunch of questions coming in the chat. I'll start with the one that's about the kiln and then work backwards. How many square feet is your kiln?
Oh, yeah, that's as many times as I've been asked that question, you'd think I would know the size of my kiln. It's I think it's in the range of 50 cubic feet, which is not a big kiln, but it's kind of important to size your kiln to the rate of your output. If you make a ton of pottery, then you probably want a good sized kiln, because you don't want to be firing every couple of weeks, although I know a lot of people do that. On the other hand, you don't want it to be so small that it takes you forever to get enough work out. This kiln is sort of, as far as all the kilns that I've seen, most of the other potters I know use. This is on the small side. To me, the advantage of that is that there's a turnaround time that's pretty quick. You can put something in, and or you can make something and not have to wait 6 months or so to see what the outcome is. Right. If your kiln is small enough, you can fire maybe every couple of months. I'm probably not firing quite that often, but
how often do you fire?
That means that you don't have to wait so long to see what's happening and what direction you want to go. Sorry, what?
We just had another question. How excuse me, how often do you fire? Roughly?
Yeah. So I think these days I'm probably averaging every 3 to 4 months.
Yeah. Great.
So that's just basically the time that it takes me to make enough work to fill the kiln.
Right. If I can keep firing questions at you, I'll air them from the chat. We have one.
Fire away.
All right. What clay body are you using primarily?
So 35 years ago, when I was taking classes at Creative Arts Workshop, the clay body that was in use then, and maybe still is a Miller Laguna stoneware, number 900, if you're keeping track at home. And it was the body that I started using. It was the body that I learned pretty much, how to make pots with. And so you kind of want to stick with what you know, and learning a new clay body takes a lot of time. So I've stuck with that particular body all these years. And I use a couple of others also. I use a white stoneware, which you probably saw a few pieces of in that first room, which is also a Miller body. It's their 511 is the number. And then every so often I'll use a porcelain.
Yeah.
Miller 550. And it's a wonderful porcelain, really terrific porcelain. But these are all Cone 10 clays.
That's a great segue to another question we have. How long do you fire a group of pieces, and do they all need the same amount of heat?
Right. Yeah. Good question. The firing normally takes about 24 hours, but that's just from cold to top temperature. So the top temperature is about 2,400 degrees, 2,450 degrees Fahrenheit. So it takes about 24 hours to build up to that temperature, and then it takes another 2 days for the kiln to cool. So it's basically a 3-day process.
Wow.
So that's how long the firing takes. And was there another question? I'm forgetting now.
Do they all need the same amount of heat? I know with wood firing, there's sort of a different zone situation. Is that the same in a gas kiln?
Yeah, you want to try to fire as evenly as possible. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a kiln that fires dead even, or is you're a very lucky person. Most kilns have various spots where they will normally fire a little higher, a little lower, and you learn to live with that, and you learn that certain things or certain glazes do okay if it's a little over or a little under your target temperature. So you learn your kiln that way, and sometimes it takes many firings to get to that point where you know all of the idiosyncrasies of your kiln.
Yeah.
And wood firing is the same way, but maybe more so because most wood kilns are much bigger and it's much harder to maintain even temperature throughout. So again, you kind of learn what works best where in your kiln. There's a wonderful potter in Minnesota, Linda Christensen, who told me that she, her kiln fires pretty well, but there's a spot where it just never reaches top temperature. So she's learned that there's a particular glaze that she uses that works just fine a little bit lower, and so she puts all that stuff there, and that way she's able to make it work.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have a request. Can you show us one of your test tiles for glazing?
Okay. Most of my test tiles are sort of squirreled away in boxes. All right, here's a bunch. What do we got here? So these are, let's see, here would be a typical test tile. Here I was experimenting with some textures.
Awesome.
And this is a Celadon, a very pale Celadon glaze. And Celadons often will have the ability to pick up texture on the surface of the clay very nicely. And so that's why I wanted to use that particular glaze. So these are just, they're about 4 inches square, a little bit less than that maybe. And I'm able to sort of slip them in between pots in the kiln so they don't take up a lot of space, and I just sort of lean them up against a kiln post. And I also did some tests. These are small plates, but I was experimenting with some different colors of slip, stenciled slip. So this leafy pattern is a stencil.
I love it. Yeah.
And so that's another kind of test. There's a bunch more. I'm not breaking anything. I'm just sort of. There's a.
Oh wow.
So these are all slips. There's no glaze on top of them. And so it makes for a fairly matte surface. It's not quite as smooth a surface as you would have if you had an actual glaze on it, but it's a perfectly functional surface. And because it's stoneware, it's watertight and won't stain. So I've actually been doing a lot of work without using any glaze at all, just decorating with colored slips. And slips are, I think, in many ways a lot easier to use than glazes. They tend to stay where you put them, and a lot of times glaze has a tendency to sort of want to run and drip and get places that you don't want it to be. So I would encourage people to experiment with slips, especially if you're working in stoneware temperatures. And since I mentioned the stencils, I wanted to show you some of those as well.
Perfect. Somebody in the chat, Liz, had just asked that, so we'd love to see it.
What great timing. Okay, so I've got these drawers full of binders, these books where I keep my stencils. Oh, there's a leaf stencil. That might have even been the very one I used for that tile I just showed you. I'm cutting these stencils out of Tyvek, which is really, if you wanted to make the perfect stencil material, that kind of would be it. I'm trying to pull out a sheet of Tyvek. So there's a couple of different kinds. This is construction grade Tyvek.
Yeah.
If you've ever driven by a building or a house that's sort of halfway finished and they haven't put the siding up yet, you'll often see that the whole structure is wrapped in this papery stuff. And it's a vapor, they use it as a vapor barrier. It's some sort of plastic. It's not woven, although it kind of has a woven texture to it. It's virtually indestructible. I really don't know how they make it or what they make it out of, but it will be here much, much longer than any of us will, I'm sure. It's amazing stuff. It's waterproof, which is why they use it as a vapor barrier. And it's impossible to tear with your bare hands. You can cut it very easily with an X-Acto knife or scissors. And so that's what I've done with all of these, is drawn a pattern, usually with a brush and Sumi ink. Sumi ink works really nicely on
Awesome.
on Tyvek. And then just sat down and cut out the bits in between. There's a couple of more leaf patterns.
Wow.
And I've also heard, although I've not done it myself, that you can run Tyvek through a what do you call them? It's a computer-driven cutter.
CNC router.
Well, there's that, which is a bigger tool. I'm talking about the little desktop things that hobbyists use to make cutouts.
Like a Cricut.
Oh, die cutter.
I think Cricut is one of the brands. Yeah. So that's another thing to explore. I don't have any advice for you on that count, but I have heard it can be done.
Very cool.
And here's some more stencils.
Wow.
So I'll put one of these stencils down on the bare clay slab, moist clay, and the moisture in the slab will adhere the stencil to the surface. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you want to run a rolling pin over it just to make sure you've got a good seal, and then you can brush the slip through the stencil, and it'll give you a print. And I could, you know what? I could do that real quick.
It's just also going to suggest, Hayne has put many short little videos and demonstrations of this technique on his Instagram. So if anyone's on Instagram and interested in seeing more, they're wonderful to see. It's really fun.
And then you get a little piece of clay. Here's, how am I doing with that? There we go. There's a little piece of porcelain. I just happened to be in the middle of doing some porcelain pieces. That's a cup that I was faceting with a potato peeler. Maybe I can show you that real quick after this. So I put the stencil down on a little slab of clay, and I'm going to take a rolling pin and make sure that stencil is pressed real well into the clay. I can take some slip. This slip I like to use is fairly thick. I don't, if you get it any runnier than this, then it's a little bit harder to use. So it's kind of yogurt consistency, or maybe even Greek yogurt consistency.
Yeah.
And because it's fairly thick, I don't really have to wait to take the stencil off, because I'm really not worried about the slip running anywhere.
Wow.
So that's what you end up with. And on a couple of those tests that I showed you earlier, like this one, what I did was I covered the whole surface of the clay with the green slip first. Then I put the stencil down and applied the blue slip. So it's really just one slip on top of another.
Wow. I do have a quick question. Do you mix your own slips with oxides?
Yeah, I find that the simplest way to make slip is simply to use the clay that you are already using for your making, for your clay body, and just add colorants and oxides to that. This particular, or this is porcelain, which makes a perfectly good slip base as well. The white stoneware, which is this, makes a very good slip base also. And I just, as I'm working, I'll just save all my scraps and let them dry out. And then you can add water to them and they will slake down very quickly. It's very hard to make a slip out of a out of a plastic clay body. It takes forever to get the water to incorporate. But if you work with perfectly dry clay, bone dry clay, the water will absorb very, very quickly. So that's an easy way of producing a slip that you can then add colorants to. And there's tons and tons of recipes out there for various slips. So take a look at those.
Great. One interesting question: how do you use the stencil on a form rather than a slab?
Yeah, it's not easy. You really, because you want to apply pressure on the stencil to get it to adhere to the clay, it's pretty hard to do that on a round surface, on a piece that's already made. So that's why I stick to doing all of the stenciling on a slab, and then making the piece out of that slab. So the stenciling happens, the decorating happens before the piece is ever made, which is sort of the other way around from how decorating usually happens.
Awesome, thank you. One question: do you do much wheel throwing, if any?
I do no throwing, but I do have a wheel, and I use it. I was just so this piece that I just made is a slab. It started out as a slab, and the slab, I cut the slab using this cardboard template. So it's kind of a fan shape.
Yeah.
And the fan then turns into a conical shape when you go to join those edges, right?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to make a cylinder with straight sides out of a slab, you would simply use a rectangular piece and then join those two edges. But if you want a piece that's tapered like this, then you have to start with a shape that's like that.
Right.
And you can see how the geometry of that works. So working from a shape like this, then I would do the faceting with a good old potato peeler, which is a great tool to put texture on a clay surface. There's so many tools that are work so much better in the clay studio than they do in the kitchen. I think this is one of them. So I've been using the potato peeler a lot, and you can sort of see these vertical facets that I've cut with the potato peeler. And then at the very end, because your top edge is going to be fairly sharp, because you've cut it with a knife, that's not going to be a very functional rim. So you want to smooth it somehow, and the easiest way for me is simply to put that on the wheel and use a chamois to smooth out that lip.
Right.
And so that's what I've done here, is smooth that lip, and actually you can sort of see that I've turned the lip outward a little bit. To me, that's just a much more comfortable lip to drink out of. So that's really the only thing I would use the wheel for. I used to throw a long time ago, and I just found that it just really wasn't a very satisfying way of making stuff. It took a lot of doing, and I came to clay rather late in my career. I'd had a whole decade working as a newspaper reporter and editor before that. So by that point, I thought, do I really have 10 or 15 years to get good enough at throwing that I can really produce the work that I want? And I kind of thought, you know what, maybe I should try some other things. And I remember it was 1985 or so that Bob Parrott, who is a potter in Madison, and his wife Anita Griffith, both still working potters and wonderful folks. Bob came into the CAW to do a little one-day workshop, carrying this metal gizmo, and bolted it to the wall, and it turned out that it was an extruder. Yeah. And he started extruding away, and I thought, oh man, this might be my ticket out of throwing. So that's kind of how that worked. So I'm doing almost all of my pieces are either slab, like these are, or extruded, or some combination of the two. These mugs over here are extruded. In this case, the extruding die is already faceted, so I don't know if you can see those, but it already has some facets in the side. So that started out as a hollow tube of clay that I then put a bottom on, and the handle is also extruded. So the handle is hollow.
Oh, wow.
And now would be a good time to go over and show you the extruders. Here's well, this is actually sort of the medium-sized one. So it's a 4-inch barrel, square barrel, and the clay goes right down in there. And when you put a die on the bottom, such as something like that, so you can see that has a circular opening, and it's made out of steel. I make these here, and this gets clamped to the bottom of the extruder barrel. Yep. And then this arm forces that piston that forces the clay down through the barrel and then out the opening of the die, and you end up, in this case, with a hollow tube of clay that you can then do all kinds of things with.
Yeah.
Right here is a much smaller version of the extruder. This is about a 2 1/4 inch barrel. And you can see I'm really fastidious about cleaning my extruders. If you're in a community studio situation, be more conscientious than I am here, and actually clean the extruder after you use it. But since I'm the only one I have to worry about, I oftentimes don't bother to clean the extruder. So this little extruder is great because this is the one I would have made the handle for that mug that I just showed you, because you don't need a big extruder to make a small piece. And then over here are all of the dies that go with the small extruder. And so here are some small circular dies. And so in all of this, I've acquired skills in welding and brazing and other kinds of metal work. Again, because it's hard to find these tools available. So I end up making them myself. Here's a square one.
So Hayne, we are just about 5 minutes till 2.
All right.
Thank you so much. And everyone will be launching that poll momentarily, but I wanted to open it up for any last minute questions. This was really great. Thank you so much for sharing your space with us.
This is great, been great fun. And I really appreciate Creative Arts Workshop for doing this. I appreciate Creative Arts Workshop for all kinds of reasons, not least of which that I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now had it not been there for me all those years ago. So it's a wonderful institution, and I want everybody who can to give it all the support that they can.
Thank you.
Hayne, are you still putting feet on teapots?
Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Okay.
So let me see. Yeah, I do have a couple of teapots that have feet on them.
So do we.
Or leg. I don't know. Do you call them feet or legs?
Well, yeah. Well, what do you call them?
I'm calling them feet, but.
Okay, so there's the bottom of a teapot. I don't know. They're kind of leggy. They're kind of feety.
Yeah.
Wow. Beautiful.
Cool.
You never want your pots to be called a feat.
Oh. Good one. I like that. That might be the only effete teapot I have.
Thanks.
Great to see you guys.
You too.
And in my spare time, I make lamps with my good friend Liz Pagano, who's also a faculty member at Creative Arts Workshop.
Yeah.
And so these are some of the lamps that we've been making. I know you weren't expecting that as part of a pottery studio tour. You get this extra content for nothing. How about that? Anyway, so Thank you again very much. This has been fun.
All right.
Any other questions? Roger, how are you? My friend Roger Bennett, he's in Dublin, Ireland.
Hello, Hayne.
He is one of the most amazing wood turners you will ever see. He just does amazing stuff. He inlays these exquisitely delicate bowls with silver, and they're just breathtaking. And we first met at was it a Philadelphia craft show?
That's right. Yeah.
And anyway, it's so great to see you.
Yeah, you too, Hayne. That was fantastic. Really fascinating. Thank you.
Well, you're next.
Tagged.
Yeah, take a look at Roger's work online. I think you'll be astonished.
Thank you, Hayne.
So Hayne, we have one other request that I'm interested in as well. Can you share some of your most useful handmade tools, possibly out of the wood, from the wood shops that you've been sharing? Thank you.
Here's my little toolkit, or one of them anyway. Crash. So here's a good example. I didn't make this knife. This is a store-bought clay Fettling knife that you can get at any clay supplier. But as you can see, I've messed with it a whole lot. The first thing I did when I noticed when I bought it was that because the handle was round, every time I put it down, it would tend to roll and roll away, beyond my grasp. So I thought, all right, I'm going to put some. I'm going to take it to my little belt sander and put some facets on it, so that'll keep it from rolling. And then I found that as I was cutting slabs, I needed to put extra pressure on the blade with my finger. And if you're cutting a whole lot of slabs, eventually you end up with a big dent and a bruise in the end of your finger, and that's not fun. So I put this piece of bamboo. I cut a slot in one side of a piece of bamboo and then attached that to the back side of the blade, wired it on there. So if I press down on that, that's a much more comfortable surface to push against than the blade itself. So, nobody's going to manufacture a Fettling knife like that. It's just too much bother. But I needed to do those two things in order to make it a useful tool for me. So, just because somebody thinks, oh, this is the way we're going to make a tool, and then we're going to sell it to potters or whoever, that doesn't mean that that's how the tool has to be. And if you find that it isn't doing what you want, then mess with it, change it. Here's another Fettling knife that I made. This is out of I don't remember what wood I used for the handle. It's some exotic hardwood. But again, I did the same thing to the handle so that it wouldn't roll. And then I made a smaller blade that to me was a little more useful. But in terms of needing a different tool or a modified tool,
that's one thing. I also just like making stuff in general, and I like making tools in particular. Here's just another piece of bamboo. Nothing special about it. I just happened to carve a little bit out of that end, and it becomes a little sort of a smoothing device for me to put down in a piece and maybe smooth that seam at the bottom. You could use it for that. Bamboo is wonderful, wonderful tool making material. That's a piece of bamboo. Bamboo is hard, it's waterproof, it's easy to cut. Great stuff. I use calipers a lot for measuring things. If I wanted to make a whole bunch of cups that are the same size, then I'll just take a calipers, measure, and then I know how big, how tall the next one has to be. These, maybe another set that I'm not seeing right now. These I made out of chopsticks, bamboo chopsticks. And I put a bolt and a tightening nut on one end. And then I stuck the other end in a pencil sharpener. And you have a really nice functional calipers for, you know, about 25 cents worth of hardware. Making your own tools can not only be a lot easier for you, but it can save you a fair amount of money. Not going to save you a fair amount of time. That's true. But you know, what else are we going to do with our time? And then I made this little tool holder out of some chunks of 2x4 that I then took to the bandsaw and cut these slots. So it's just a regular knockabout thing, and I've knocked it off of my workbench any number of times, and the fact that it's wooden means that it'll survive better than if it were made out of something else. So keep that in mind. Your own clumsiness, your own tendency to be tough on your tools. And I do have to mention one other thing in terms of tools. Here are a couple of tools. I didn't make these, but they were made by a wonderful woman, Nancy Carroll. She's the mother of a good friend of mine, Sarah Carroll, who many of you might remember from her days in New Haven. Nancy had been a potter at one point, and then she became a woodworker. And I haven't talked to her in some time, and I don't know if she's still making tools. But for a while there, she was making these just absolutely lovely pottery tools out of really wonderful wood. This is I don't know what that is. Roger, you need to be here to tell me what wood this is. But she uses beautiful, beautiful wood. Sometimes she uses bird's eye maple, and her the tools are lovely, and they're really well made because she, having been a potter, she knows what potters need to use. So these are the only tools that I've ever used that I haven't had to do anything to. They're perfect just as they are. And the best thing was that I was able to trade her pots for tools, and so I really appreciate her design and her workmanship on these tools. She goes by Lunacy Arts, or at least she did. Luna, like Luna Moth, and then C, letter C, Lunacy Arts. So take a look at her. wonderful stuff.
Great. All right, Hayne. Well, thank you so much for inviting us into your space and for your time. I know between Robin, myself, and yourself, we had talked a little bit about demonstrations, so hopefully we'll be able to work that out in the coming weeks, because I think everyone has really enjoyed this and would like to see more. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and please join us for upcoming events.
Lovely.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
I just signed up for a thing about